All right, is this working? Okay, so in today's video, we're going to take a look at the Andante, which is the second movement of the Bach second violin sonata. This is going to be a new episode for the first time ever live streamed on this channel. This is going to be a new episode of the series that I call Making Decisions on the Violin. In this series, I, a professional violinist, take a look at a piece of music that I either have never played before or haven't played in quite some time. What piece of music I decide to play is often determined by the comments. So if there's a piece of music you want me to play in the future, please leave those in the comments below. With that, let's take a look at the beginning of this Andante. I'm going to pull up the music now so that maybe I'm not the only one looking at it. How about that? All right, so we're going to talk about what I'm doing, how I'm going about making these decisions, and exactly what I think works the best, at least for me. And hopefully in doing so, you can see a little bit into the mind of how I go about practicing, and hopefully you'll learn some tips about how you should be learning and approaching new pieces. Full disclosure, I've definitely played this piece before, although I haven't played it in quite some time. I did, however, take a look at it briefly before turning on this stream because it's Bach, and Bach is not necessarily sight readable. So I wanted to be in at least a little bit of good shape. So it's not going to be a total sight read like I've done in perhaps some of my older videos, but I hope you enjoy nonetheless. Let's take a look. From the top here, we start with this figure that is basically the main difficulty in this entire piece, which is this unique bowing that allows us to create this harmonic ostinato on the bass line, as well as have this melody on the top line. So we can see this broken down here. Actually, I'll expand that for you. We have this lower line here of this ostinato, and we can see that these eighth notes just run through this entire piece, basically everywhere. But we also have a separation of that, and we have this beautiful melody that we need to sound soaring in between. So if we want to keep that ostinato going throughout, it's a very challenging feat. It requires a very specific technique that we're going to go over now. So this technique that we're using in this is one where we're essentially establishing the double stop. We can do this on an open string, G and D. And without letting go of the D string, we're going to let go of the G string. And then we're going to, again, touch the G string. And if this is done properly, it'll create a rearticulation of that G string and therefore the feeling of an eighth note ostinato underneath. It's a little bit tricky. And one of the things that you should focus on is where exactly your string level is. We talk a lot about string level on this channel and in violin playing in general. Essentially, all that it is it's talking about where your elbow should be in relation to your strings. So if I turn this way, you can see a little bit better. Where my elbow is should be related to where my bow is. My elbow essentially should be right in line with that. My upper arm. I like to think of this as my string level. So whether I'm playing at the tip or I'm playing at the frog, that string level should be the same. So where that string level is going to be wherever is comfortable for both strings to be played at once. This would be considered a double stop string level. And instead of moving that string level to create these differences, we're going to simply use our wrist and a little bit of our lower arm, this forearm, to move in and out of that string level. So we're going to go from a joint string level, we're going to move our hand and lower arm a little lower to get out of that string level. And then we're going to raise it again to get back into the string level. Alternatively, you can start from the get-go, feeling like the string level is right on the D string. And then instead of feeling like you're coming out of the string level for each, you're actually going into the double string level. So you're kind of coming over for the G string. Now, this is a different format that I've done in the past, so if you're watching live and you have any questions as we go, please feel free to leave those in the comments, because it's for the first time I actually have the opportunity to give you any answers of tangential ideas in real time, and I'm happy to do so, so long as we can also find the time to make our way through this piece of repertoire. So, with that idea in mind, we're going to take a look at the beginning again and try and execute this with that proper technique. So the bowing I like to use at the very beginning is one where we're doing a down bow for all three of those first eighth notes. So we're doing that technique that we just went over, where we're playing the double stop, coming in and out of that string level. But the last time we go over to the G string, we go further this time. And we go all the way past so that we're no longer on the D string. And I like to add a little bit of vibrato there to really emphasize that. Then I would go to the up bow, just as you see written here. Now, in general, once again, we're trying to separate the idea of this melody and this ostinato. We're trying to make them sound very different. So even when we have the same rhythm, in this case, on this fourth note, we have an eighth note both in the melody, and we have an eighth note in the bass. I don't want to treat them equally. I want to have that ostinato feel as if it's consistent throughout, and then allow that top note to sound a little bit more melodic by contrast. So one of the ways I'll do that is by continuing to emphasize this technique, where I'll actually come off of that lower string, again using that same mechanic we've talked about. And we're going to use that idea every single time that we're playing an eighth note's worth of music on the top line, which is the melody, and an eighth note's worth of music on the bottom line. So if we look here, that means in this section here, we have an eighth note worth of music on the top and bottom. Here we have two 16th notes on the top and an eighth note on the bottom. Two 16th notes is equivalent to an eighth note. And then likewise here. We see that that keeps kind of happening, but every single time it happens, even though it's happening where we have an eighth note on both, we're actually going to release our bow from the lower note from that ostinato to allow the melody to sound unique. I'm going to go right from that fourth note. So essentially by the time I'm playing that second 16th note, you can see that I'm actually already releasing from that lower note. And then I go over for both again, release, and then knock over for that C. So that last two notes of that measure are probably the most challenging within this idea, which is where we're doing this double stop. We have to release the G string so that we only hear the D, and then we have to knock over for just the G. And so far, I'm just using exactly the fingerings that have been marked here. Whenever there's no fingerings, we can always assume it's going to be either in first position or whatever the lowest position is that's necessary to accomplish it. In this case, since it's within the staff, it's going to be first position for that beginning. The only interesting thing that's happened so far is that we have that one right here with a circle on it. When we look at that one with a circle on it, I'm looking at the Galamian edition. This indicates that we're using a stretched finger. Anytime you see this marking right here, that circle is indicating a stretched finger. A stretched finger can sometimes be compressed down or it can be stretched up, as the name would suggest. And in this case, since our 1 would normally want to be on an E natural, it's going to be stretched up to that F natural. So what really makes a stretch and not a shift is that we maintain our positioning. We maintain our double contact where our thumb is and where our first finger is making contact with the instrument. And we just elongate that finger. And then it goes back. Here's our first shift. This is measure 3. We're going to shift that third finger to second position. And then we have our second position, second finger underneath, which will give us that same C natural. When you're doing this kind of shift where you're shifting between two positions but you have a note that's carried over, it's kind of like a finger substitution. It's really important that that note remains in tune. Even the inexperienced listener will often be able to tell when a note that should have been the same sounds different the second time it's played. So I would focus extra hard on making sure that that second finger is really, really in tune when we play that C natural. I say that and then I immediately don't play it really, really in tune. Let's see if I can do it. So after we've played that second position, we're going to shift back down into first position. And whenever you're shifting, you need to know what finger you're moving off of. And you can either choose the last finger that you placed, which in this case is the fourth finger on the B natural, which would find an A natural on the way down. Or you can use another finger. In this case, I think it's a little bit more comfortable for me to use a finger that's both in the chord that I was just playing in that position, speaking of that chord in particular, and the next chord, which is that second beat of the measure. So that third finger then can bring us from that second position into that first position. So really thinking of actually this note going to this note. Whenever you're shifting, even when you're shifting from a triple stop to another triple stop, it's really important to have a clear idea of which note or which finger is responsible for the shift. I like to think of it as which finger is carrying you through the shift. We call it sometimes the departure finger. Just as a little aside, this is one of the hardest notes in this piece. Landing on that octave, it's a true test of whether or not you actually succeeded in shifting back into a proper first position. Alright, that brings us to measure 4. We're in first position right here, still. And we're going to continue on in first position here as well with that third finger. Something to note that's going to be challenging here is that we have our third finger on this G natural and we want it to be prepared for this D natural. So even though we're going to start by playing a sixth here between E and G, we still need the third finger down already on both strings. And third finger fifths, if you've followed the channel previously, you probably already know third finger and fourth finger fifths are the bane of my existence, and really most violinists. They're very, very challenging. That being said, we're going to use the same technique we've been using this entire time, which is in general, again, even when we have equal values of rhythm, meaning an eighth note's worth of music on the top bow and an eighth note's worth of music on the bottom. I'm saying bow, but I mean the top line and the bottom line, as we do in this situation where we have 2 16th notes on the top and we have an eighth note on the bottom. That's essentially equivalent. Regardless of that, because we have a difference of the ostinato and the melody, once again, we want to release from that ostinato just to help us solidify the idea of the separation. So even though we need to prepare that fifth on both strings, we're actually not really going to hear it. Jeez. Because we're going to release from the lower string. We come up to our next shift here, and we have a very easy departure note here. The third finger can take us up from the D natural to the E. When you shift between these two chords, or between these two eighth notes, from this D to this E, it's important to note that the relationship between 1 in first position and 1 in second position is going to be different. Third finger is going to be shifting up a whole step, and first finger is only going to be shifting up a half step to find that F natural. So there's a little bit of expansion happening in the hand. Whenever there's this inconsistency moving from position to position, it's really important to understand what's happening. Are you shifting a half step and stretching the third finger up a half step, or are you shifting a whole step and only stretching your first finger down a half step? So in one version, you're shifting a whole step and leaving your one behind essentially, and in the other, you're shifting a half step and extending the third finger. It seems subtle, it seems almost unimportant, but it actually will be a big difference in your consistency of intonation. For me personally, since I like to linger my mental capacity on my lower fingers, I think it's easier for me to think of shifting with relation to the first finger in terms of position. So I'm still shifting on that third finger, I'm still moving it up and using it to guide me, but my shift is going to be predicated on the distance my first finger is moving. So from first position to second position, I'm moving from an E natural, or in this case a B natural. I'm moving from that B natural up a half step and over a string. And then once we get to that second position, we don't stay there very long because we're going to shift immediately back down that half step again. And if you thought about shifting a half step rather than a whole step, then you're simply going to be shifting back down a half step, but you need to recall that that third finger moved extra. So it needs to move back down extra. So the third finger needs to move a full whole step, whilst you yourself shift a half step. That was messy. Let's try that again. We've gotten to the most difficult bar of this entire section, I believe, measure 7. The second half of measure 7 is really challenging because it puts us into my least favorite position on the violin, which is half position. It's a position between first and 0. So we go into this low position where we move our first finger down to that F natural, and we actually have to move our thumb down as well. And then our second finger rather, instead of being where it would normally go on, let's say, a C natural, It moves all the way down to a B natural. So we get this really awkward compressed hand here. And then we follow that up with the fourth finger. Instead of being on, let's say, a B natural or a B flat on the E string, it's going to be all the way down on this A, which is super awkward. It really solidifies this idea of this cramped hand here. And we stay in it for both of these quadruple stops. This is extremely uncomfortable. It's super unnatural, and it's not really in line with anything else we practice on the instrument. Even when we practice scales, we almost never practice this kind of a position. So it's going to just take extra time in practice to get it really comfortable. In fact, before I turned on the camera today, this is basically what I looked at. I looked at it ahead of time, and it still doesn't sound great. So you can see how challenging that can be. But with enough practice, if you have it for a recital, for example, you can definitely get it to feel quite comfortable. If you try to come up with an alternative fingering, there are some. The most obvious is going to be where we do start in that kind of half position, but it's not as true of a half position. Because right after we hit that chord, instead of playing a fourth finger on the A, we could stretch our third finger up. And then we could play this in first position. But when you do that, you're going to have to make your second fingers do a lot of jumping around. Or not necessarily your second fingers, but whatever finger you're playing the B naturals with are going to have to jump around. Your second finger in this case is going to have to jump from that first B natural to that G natural. And then the second time you play this B natural, it would be on a first finger if you use this fingering. And it would have to move from here to a low 1. Which is not impossible, but it's just a little bit clunky for my taste. If you do the proper half position, man, I am messing this up. If you do the proper half position, it should work out nicely, assuming you practice. Or you just get to establish the position and just live with it. So it's just rather one thing to practice than a few separate things. Granted, that single thing that you do have to practice is a little bit more challenging, but I think it's worth it. It's a healthy trade-off. I personally like to hone in on specific things when I'm practicing and get them really, really comfortable rather than having a ton of things to worry about. Let's go right for measure 8. There's another third finger fifth for you. Those are not comfortable at all. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about in this section is this arrival here. It's really interesting. We have the devil's interval here, which is the tritone. It's when we have this augmented fourth or diminished fifth. It's a really pretty interval in my opinion, but it's very dissonant. And to me, it feels like we've really arrived at this kind of big question, and we need to see where it goes. And I think musically, it makes a lot of sense to do a little bit of time taking here before we do this small cadenza out of it. Took the first ending. Let's take a look at that. So I did a bowing here that I have handwritten from my actual physical part that I scanned, and I can see what I was thinking. I actually don't hate it, but I was definitely not ready for it. I'm talking about this bowing between measure 9 and measure 10. This down bow here, it makes us play a down bow right after we just played a down bow. Which can be definitely very awkward, especially if you're not prepared for it. But let's prepare for it. I think all we need to do is use a little bit more bow for this little cadenza, and then we need to save a little bit more bow on the break. Whenever we break triple stops or quadruple stops, where we break in the bow is a very important question to answer. Generally, it's going to depend on how important you want the bass notes to sound. If I want to emphasize the bass half of my triple stop, then I'm going to likely do a later break. That time I just broke a little above the balance point. But if I want it to sound more even, I might do the break a little bit lower, perhaps beneath the balance point. That will also give me the opportunity to, once I've struck the chord, to have a lot more bow left over to hold. And if we have that, then we can plan to reserve some amount of bow for this bass note at the finale for that down bow. That time I took the second ending because let's go on. Going from this second ending here. Second half of this piece deals with a lot of the same issues that we've been dealing with so far, with the same kinds of techniques for articulation for these double stops and ostinatos, but it's a little bit more challenging. Some of the harmonies are a little bit more interesting, and we also end up with a lot more of these kind of tight finger positions. Let's take a look. This is the measure after the second ending, measure 12. Yeah, that is some complicated stuff. Let's take a look. Let's break it down. So after this annoying part with all these third finger fifths, which you've heard me complain about before, we're going right into this really thorny section. If you do the fingering that's written here, which I quite like, you're going right from using a third finger on this G sharp to essentially swapping. So we go from this third finger on the G sharp to essentially swapping so that the third finger moves down to this D natural, and then we replace that with a fourth finger on the G sharp. So we're ending up already with this kind of collapsed, compressed hand. It's very important when we do this that we try our best not to overly press on our fourth finger and cause excess tension in the hand. Ooh, that is thorny. So after we've done that measure, we go right into a shift. But it's an easy shift because we have our first finger on the B natural and we can just move it up a half step to the second position. Once again, while we're playing this, we kind of have to be ready for that fifth already. Of course, we can't have the fifth already preset because we need to hear the C natural. But this is a kind of complicated technique because you only have really two options here. You can either place the third finger down right here and then lift it or maneuver it over so that it's in the fifth right after we play this second finger. Or you can place it in a kind of quasi fifth position where it's not exactly where you would normally place your third finger. It's in a different kind of angle, and that angle is one that essentially is ready for the fifth. So the way you would find this in practice is you'd play that fifth, and then you would go from there to tilt your finger off of the fifth. So essentially, you are preparing your finger for the fifth, but you're leaning it off so that it only strikes a single string. It's a little bit of an advanced idea, a little bit complicated, but in my opinion, it's probably the best solution for this measure. Right after we did that complicated third finger maneuver, we also have to get it even further over, not only so that it's on the A string, so that it goes far enough that it's now off the D string as well, to reveal the F natural underneath. We can, once again, place our first finger on that F natural, or we can have it already preset on both from the very beginning, which might be a little bit easier. Well, I wouldn't say easier. It's going to take some practice, but I think in performance, it would be easier. So then we just do a simple shift here. The suggested fingering was to shift after we do this tied E natural. So the suggested fingering, as you can see perhaps underneath here, is to do this tied E natural and then to shift down. I'll do a downwards arrow to first position so that we're on a 2 and a 4. But really, that to me was quite uncomfortable. It might work for you, but I prefer to just stay, which is why I rewrote this 3 here, and then shift down afterwards. Now these are old fingerings, and it's interesting to see that I still agree with them. Let's try that again. That was really sloppy. Lots to do there. That is tough stuff. But that's why Bach is always worth revisiting, no matter how far along in your violin studies you get. It's all pretty straightforward once we've shifted down into first. Here we have this revisit of that technique that we did at the very beginning. Here we're going to shift on the second finger up that augmented second, which is the same thing as a minor third. Alternatively, you can shift up a whole step and then stretch the second finger up a half step. That might be a little bit simpler. If we do that, then our first finger ends up where it should be, which is in this kind of, I call it second and a half position, where we're not where the first finger would be on a C natural on the A string, but where it would be on a C sharp, or in this case on an F sharp on the D string, which is the equivalent spot when you're thinking about the kind of fingerboard and the shape of it. because our first finger is in the correct spot, if we do this fingering, then we can just compress the hand down into it to find this really clustered chord. Just one of the most physically uncomfortable finger patterns you can have. And right after we play that chord, I play the third finger on the B natural, and then I just do the exact opposite of what we did to find that chord, where we compress. Now, after the B natural, we're just going to expand everything a half step away from that first finger. Then we use this half step between C natural and B to shift down back into first position here. That's actually quite comfortable. All right, so this is the new hardest bit in this entire piece. It was measure 7 previously, but we found a new, more difficult spot in measure 17. By the way, if you want to get your own copy of this music, the entire sonatas are public domain, obviously in America because Bach's been dead for a very long time. So you can find all this stuff on IMSLP. There's actually a link in the description of where you can download that if you're in the United States. You can also buy the Galamian version on Amazon. I don't know how much it goes for, but I like that version. It's got these really nice fingerings most of the time. And it also has the original manuscripts in the back of the book, which is quite nice. All right, with that aside, let's try from that horrible measure, measure 17. Here we have an open string, and whenever we have this, whenever we have an open string after a chord, we need to decide what finger is going to shift, because even when we have an open string, we still want to sense that we're shifting on a finger. We want to have a real relationship with the top of the fingerboard. We don't always just want to think about our double contact shifting, which is really great. We also want to have a real sense of space and distance on top of the fingerboard. So even though we have this open E, I would recommend highly that you find a finger to shift. In this case, I'm going to choose the first finger because I actually never lifted it. It's going to move up a whole step. So we got that first finger, whole step, half step, and that second finger has to be ready for that fifth at the top. And then we shift all the way back down to first. And then fourth finger. That's always a scary test in performance. Will your fourth finger match your E string in the context of this whole piece? Very, very close. With enough practice, hopefully the answer is yes. See, fifths are really the bane of my existence. That's not even a fifth on a third finger. That's a fifth on a second. The few pieces in the Bach catalog that I really kind of insist on doing the repeat on the second half as well as the first half. Partially because the first ending is just written so beautifully, but also because it's just such a great piece and it is still quite symmetrical if we do the repeat on both sides. That is some tough stuff. I just kind of glossed over it, so let's just take a look at measure 22 right here and go over some of these little compressions and what we might want to focus on when we're practicing them. So I'm doing something a little different than what Galamian had originally suggested. If you look here, you can barely see it, but there's a 3 marked there because he wanted a compression here. But instead of doing that, I'm doing what kind of we did earlier in the piece, where I'm doing a stretched first finger above that B natural placement to that C natural. And then, therefore, these fingers, that 4th finger, well, really just that 4th finger, is not going to be a circled 4, which means a stretch. It's actually just going to be in a natural position because we're going to just be playing in first. The finale of this piece, when we play that final chord, it's an example of a chord where I would break it very slowly. Well, maybe not rhythmically slowly, but I would use a lot of bow before I break it. So I'm not breaking the chord before the balance point. I'm really going to be breaking it closer to the halfway point. Somewhere in between the halfway point and the balance point. That's going to allow us to really establish that C so that we can really feel like we've arrived home in our tonic key here. With that, we've gone through the entire Andante movement here, something that was suggested by a previous comment on our series, Making Decisions in the Violin. If there's a piece of music you'd like me to take a look at in the future, please feel free to leave that in the comments as well. Thank you so much for joining on the live. We had actually more viewers than I expected today. This is the very first live stream I've ever done on this channel, and I really wanted to do it because this format of video, I was finding I was trying to over-edit, essentially. And really, it should just be an authentic representation of what practice looks like for me when I'm taking a look at either a brand new piece or a piece I'm not super familiar with. So I think the best way to give you a true rendition of that is to do it really on the spot. And hopefully, in the future, we'll have some activity in our live chat, and I'll be able to answer any tangential questions. The idea is to do this basically every Monday around this time. So if you're interested, make sure you're subscribed so that you don't miss a future live stream. And of course, I still make other videos on this channel that I try to post every single week. So keep an eye out for those as well. Make sure you ring the bell if you can and like this video so that hopefully other people will see it even after the fact. Thank you so much for watching.